Nobody handed me a conspiracy theory. What I found by accident, buried in the margins of architectural surveys, hidden inside municipal engineering reports, staring back at me from photographs that historians have quietly tucked into the footnotes of a story they'd rather not re-examine. I wasn't looking for a lost civilization. I was looking for anomalies, and anomalies, once you start counting them, have a way of becoming something else entirely. Here's what stopped me cold. The physical world left behind by the people we call pre-industrial, the roads, the buildings, the water systems, the trade infrastructure, doesn't line up with the people we've been told built it. There's a word historians and archaeologists use when artifacts don't match the civilization credited with producing them: anachronistic, out of time, out of place. What I found wasn't one anachronism, it was thousands of them, layered across multiple continents, spanning multiple decades, all pointing in the same direction. Something was here before us. Something organized, functional, and far more advanced than the story we inherited allows. So forget the mythology for a moment. Forget the grand claims and the YouTube thumbnails with glowing symbols and ancient maps. Let's talk about something far more grounding. What did daily life actually look like inside this forgotten world? What did people do when they woke up, moved through their cities, went to work, came home? Because when you reconstruct the lived experience from what physically remains, the picture that emerges is nothing short of extraordinary. Start with the buildings, because the buildings are the most honest witnesses we have. Walk into any preserved structure from the mid-1800s in Boston, Budapest, Kolkata, or Cape Town, and the first thing you notice is scale. Ceilings that don't make practical sense by the logic of the era. 14, 15, 16 feet of vertical space in rooms that supposedly housed people who heated their homes with coal and wood. Ask any engineer what that ceiling height means from a thermodynamic standpoint. Heating a room that tall in a northern winter would have been expensive, inefficient, and difficult. So why do they exist in such overwhelming numbers, across so many cities, in so many climates? The official answer is aesthetics, architectural fashion. The wealthy liked tall rooms. But when you find those proportions in working-class tenements, in provincial factories, in buildings nowhere near the centers of wealth or taste, that answer evaporates. Something else drove those dimensions. Maybe light distribution, maybe air pressure management, maybe acoustic design, maybe purposes we've genuinely lost the language to describe. And then there's the ornamental work. Crown molding, carved with geometric precision that appears, and I want to be careful with this word, identical. Not similar, identical. The same mathematical progressions, the same interlocking patterns, the same symbolic grammar appearing on buildings in Philadelphia, Bucharest, Melbourne, and Lahore. Buildings supposedly designed by independent architects in independent decades with no shared blueprint. Coincidence stops being a viable explanation when you've counted the 100th example. The windows compound the mystery. Positioned not arbitrarily but aligned with solar trajectories, angled to catch winter morning light at specific hours, oriented to prevent summer afternoon overheating, spaced to create cross-ventilation patterns that passive cooling engineers study today as genius design. These weren't accidents of proportion. These were calculated decisions embedded into the fabric of structures built supposedly by people who didn't have the mathematical tools to make those calculations. Waking up in that world meant waking up inside an engineered environment, a system, one designed with intentions that went far beyond mere shelter. Step outside that building and the questions don't slow down, they accelerate. The clothing in photographs from the 1860s and 1870s tells a story that's been hiding in plain sight for over a century. These aren't garments sewn by hand from locally sourced fabric. These are industrially produced textiles, tightly woven cottons, imported silks, finished woolens, appearing not just in the wardrobes of aristocrats, but on the backs of merchants, workers, teachers, and farmers in provincial towns, thousands of miles from any known center of manufacture. Think about what that requires. Cotton arriving from South Asia, wool from Southern Hemisphere sheep farms, silk from Chinese provinces, all of it processed, dyed, cut, and assembled into standardized garments at a scale that implies factories. All of it distributed through transportation networks capable of moving perishable fashion goods reliably enough that rural buyers could depend on seasonal availability. If you believe the official history of 19th century transportation, horse carts, muddy roads, weeks between cities, the closet of an average 1870s merchant shouldn't look the way it looks in the photographs. But it does, and that means something moved those goods, something efficient, something organized, something that either hasn't been adequately documented or has been deliberately de-emphasized in the historical record. Here's what I want you to do the next time you look at a satellite image of a city built before 1900. Look at the street layout. Not the modern additions, not the post-war suburbs, but the original core. What shape do you see? Again and again in cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, you find the same geometry. Radial boulevards extending from central nodes, cardinal alignments too precise for terrain following, grid systems with proportional relationships between block dimensions that suggest they were calculated rather than improvised, star-shaped formations visible only from altitude, formations that predate the balloon, let alone the aerial photograph. Who was this designed for? Who was the intended viewer of a street plan that only makes sense from above? And the streets themselves, not improvised paths worn by centuries of foot traffic, but engineered corridors with deliberate grades, subsurface drainage that still functions, load-bearing foundations designed for heavier traffic than horses and wooden wheels. Inspection any major 19th century avenue, and you'll find the underlying infrastructure was built to tolerances that modern urban planners treat as professional standards, not historical achievements. The street railway systems visible in photographs from the 1880s are perhaps the most direct challenge to the official timeline. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands operating electric or cable-driven rail lines by 1885. Not experiments, not demonstrations. Operational public transit systems with scheduling, fare collection, route networks, and mechanical infrastructure requiring constant maintenance, all appearing within years of each other in cities on multiple continents, all requiring engineering coordination, capital investment, and technical expertise that supposedly didn't exist at scale until a generation later. The silence around how this happened is not an absence of evidence, it is a shape, and shapes tell their own story. The canal networks get less attention than the railways, but they may be the most revealing artifact of all. At the height of the canal era, before railways supposedly made them obsolete, the waterway infrastructure of Europe alone covered tens of thousands of miles, not natural rivers, engineered channels, precisely graded cuts through hillsides, aqueducts crossing valleys, lock systems managing elevation changes across hundreds of miles of continuous navigable corridor, and every canal built to compatible dimensions, every lock designed to accept barges of standardized size, every junction engineered to allow cargo transfer between networks. This is not what organic independent development looks like. This is what a unified engineering standard looks like. One technical specification, distributed across an entire continent, implemented over decades by builders who had never met each other, in countries with different governments, different languages, different economic systems, all arriving at the same answer. The volumes those canals move stagger the imagination even by today's standards. Single barge loads that would require 40 horse-drawn wagons, networks collectively shifting millions of tons of goods annually through systems that required seasonal management, structural maintenance, and operational coordination, all of this functioning smoothly, not struggling toward function, not in early development, but running as mature infrastructure by the early 19th century. Mature. That word is the problem. You don't get mature infrastructure without a long period of development preceding it. But the historical record doesn't show that developmental period. It shows the systems appearing, fully formed, as if inherited rather than invented. The accepted story of the Industrial Revolution describes a gradual process. Inventors tinkering in workshops, entrepreneurs betting on unproven technologies, decades of experimentation before factory systems achieved the scale that transformed economies. The photographs and records say otherwise. Textile mills in operation by the 1830s with annual output measured in millions of yards. Iron foundries in the 1840s producing structural components to dimensional tolerances that required precision measurement. Chemical plants, glassworks, ceramic manufactories, paper mills, all operating at industrial volume in the decades supposedly before industrial techniques matured, and the workforce inside these facilities, not apprentices learning a new craft but workers demonstrating expertise, operating complex machinery with the fluency of long familiarity, maintaining production schedules that imply deep institutional knowledge. The interchangeable parts problem is worth pausing on specifically. By the 1850s, standardized components were being manufactured in separate facilities in different cities, in different countries, and assembled interchangeably. That requires not just manufacturing precision, but an agreed-upon dimensional standard distributed across a network of producers who all chose to comply with it. That's not invention, that's coordination. And coordination at that scale requires communication infrastructure, institutional authority, and technical consensus that the official history of the 1850s simply cannot support. Let's be direct about what this means economically. The commodity markets of the mid-19th century show price coordination across oceanic distances that is, by modern information theory, mathematically impossible without the telegraph, which wasn't fully operational until the 1860s, and transoceanic only from 1866. But grain prices in Chicago tracked grain prices in Liverpool before that cable existed. Cotton futures in New York reflected harvest reports from India before any wire crossed the Atlantic. Merchants in London were hedging against supply disruptions in Shanghai with sophisticated financial instruments, bills of exchange, insurance contracts, investment syndicates that required enforceable legal frameworks, verified counterparty information, and trusted communication across thousands of miles. This didn't emerge spontaneously. Financial instruments of that complexity require institutional infrastructure, clearing houses, verification protocols, enforcement mechanisms, all of which had to be built, staffed, maintained, and trusted across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The fact that they existed and functioned is extraordinary. The fact that we've stopped asking how is more extraordinary still. There's a detail in photographs from the 1860s and 1870s that doesn't get enough attention. The windows, not the buildings, the windows, glowing, after dark. In cities we're told had barely primitive lighting. Streets illuminated not by scattered oil lanterns but by organized municipal systems with standardized fixtures, coordinated maintenance, and reliable operation. Gas distribution networks running beneath city blocks, feeding thousands of fixtures with pressurized fuel through underground infrastructure that required precise engineering to prevent the kinds of catastrophic failures that pressurized combustible gas systems are prone to. And then, appearing in the 1870s and 1880s, electrical lighting. Not experimental demonstrations in wealthy parlors, municipal arc lighting in public squares, building illumination, early grid distribution, all of it supposedly decades ahead of when Edison's practical incandescent bulb supposedly made electric light viable. The rooftops tell a stranger story still. Elevated platforms on government buildings, anchor masts on civic structures, rooftop installations that don't correspond to any function official architectural history describes. If you approach them without preconceptions, the structures suggest one thing: something was landing there, or mooring there, or being guided toward those locations from above. The lighter-than aircraft were real. The patent applications are in public archives. The engineering journals discussed propulsion, navigation, gas production, hull design. Newspaper accounts from multiple countries described aerial exhibitions. Photographs exist of structures that, absent any other explanation, served aerial infrastructure purposes. This wasn't science fiction. This was documented technological development that was quietly written out of the mainstream historical narrative sometime in the early 20th century. Why? This is the part of the investigation that unsettles me more than any artifact, any building, any anomalous photograph. The forgetting wasn't accidental. It has the texture of intention. Engineering journals from the 1880s discuss hydraulic energy systems, atmospheric pressure applications, and distributed power networks in ways that simply disappear from professional literature by 1920, not superseded by better theories, not refuted by experimental evidence, just absent, replaced by a different framework that assumes different premises and asks different questions. Building techniques that produce structures we cannot economically replicate today, not because we lack the tools, but because we've lost the integrated systems thinking that made those buildings possible, were replaced by standardized construction methods that are measurably inferior in acoustic performance, thermal regulation, and structural longevity. Residents of early 20th century cities left records of this transition. Complaints about deteriorating water quality. Nostalgia for transit systems that once ran on time. References to infrastructure capabilities that existed within their own memories but were no longer available. The official narrative labeled these people romantics, reactionaries resistant to progress. But what if they were witnesses? What if they were describing, in real time, the systematic dismantling of a functional civilization and its replacement with something newer, simpler, and far more legible to centralize control? The evidence hasn't disappeared. It's hiding in plain sight, wearing the costume of the ordinary. Walk through the older sections of any city that hasn't been completely rebuilt, count the ceiling heights, trace the window alignments, map the street geometry from above, follow the underground drainage, read the load tolerances of the bridges, ask the structural engineers what construction methods produce those results, and whether those methods are currently taught. The answer you'll get, if you ask the right people, in the right rooms, is that the construction methods are poorly understood, the material science is partially lost, and the integrated design thinking that produced those outcomes isn't being taught because it isn't well enough documented to teach. That's the admission hiding inside the official history. Not that something was lost, but that something was never adequately recorded, which, if you think about it, is an even stranger claim, because civilizations record what matters to them, and a civilization that fails to record how its most impressive engineering achievements were accomplished is either hiding something or replacing something it doesn't want remembered. The Tartarian world, whatever name you give it, whatever boundaries you draw around it, produced daily life inside systems we're still living inside the ruins of. People moved through coordinated cities, worked in sophisticated facilities, wore globally sourced clothing, ate food, moved through continental supply chains, and came home to engineered domestic environments that outperform much of what we've built since. And then, within a few generations, the knowledge of how it all worked together was gone. The streets remember, the buildings remember. The canals, dry now in many places, still trace routes that follow geometric principles too precise for guesswork. What happened here isn't a mystery waiting to be solved. It's a memory waiting to be recovered. The only question left is whether we're willing to do the work of remembering.